So I have the pleasure, but also the challenge of trying to draw together the various insights that have been shared by my fellow panelists. So let's see how it goes. I think what I wanted to do today on behalf, given that CALP is the global partnership of humanitarian actors working on CTP, cash transfer programming, we're both the kind of the aggregator and the catalyst of all the incredible investments and innovations that are being made in cash transfer programming. They've taken us from that sort of 1% of humanitarian aid in 2010. You can see what that meant in terms of the figures within particular organizations such as WFP, to 8.5% now, and thinking ahead about, well, where do we want to get to, and whether that's in terms of a kind of monetary or percentage target per se, or whether it's just acknowledging that there is still significant potential to increase the scale and quality of cash transfer programming. So we started the session today with an overview of what the 6 grand bargain commitments in relation to cash are. And whilst they're a really valuable goal, I think translating those into action isn't always obvious. You know, what does that mean for the role of different organizations? What does it mean for donors, for NGOs, for the UN, for private sector, etc.? And at the same time, whilst they are, again, you know, a valuable set of commitments, they're not exhaustive. As Paul mentioned earlier on, there have been a number of other kind of policy developments over the last few years that have set the agenda in terms of cash transfer programming. So one is the high-level panel on cash transfers, which Paul was part of. There's also been 10 principles by ECHO on multipurpose cash systems, and then individual agencies' commitments at the World Humanitarian Summit as well. So as CALP, we thought, okay, what is it that we can do to try and make this into a collective roadmap, something that's a bit more actionable, and that we can use to collectively track progress against all these commitments. So we've come up with this global framework for action, which if you download, it's 2 pages, it looks something like this if you download it off our website. What it does it's nothing new. What it does is it just draws on all those existing commitments and tries to put it all in one place and say, okay, what is it that needs to be done, you know, by 2020, let's say, to significantly increase the scale and quality of cash transfer programming. So you can see the 6 objectives up there. I don't know how small it is for those of you at the back, but effectively, I mean, I'll just run through them quickly so we know, because I'll be using them as a kind of framework for the rest of the discussion. So the first is ensure sufficient funding is available for cash programming. Now, of course, that's within a broader context of, you know, constrained humanitarian funding, but nonetheless, ensure funding is prioritized for cash programming. Ensure cash is routinely considered across sectors, contexts, agencies. Build sufficient capacity for cash transfer programming. Ensure the quality of cash transfer programming, and that really builds on the inputs of my colleagues earlier on and the importance of focusing on outcomes. Strengthen coordination of cash transfer programming, and I'll touch on why that's particularly important in terms of enabling the multi-sectoral use of cash. And build evidence and innovate. As Paul raised earlier on, there's a constant need to remake that positive case for cash and continuously address fears and risk. And actually, I think the words fear and risk came out in both Paul and Tahir's presentation. So this is a particularly important one. So with any collective agenda like this, it's also important to track progress and see, well, how are we doing against all of this? And so what CALP has done in that regard, and again, everything that we do is with our members, and actually the initiative I'm going to be talking about has both WFP and Paul on its steering committee. We're about to publish in January a report that we're quite ambitiously calling the State of the World's Cash Report. It's the first of its kind, but the idea is to provide the most authoritative summary possible of the current state of cash transfer programming. And it basically uses this framework, these 6 objectives, as a structure. And showcase. I mean, so it was developed through a methodology that included 200 or so individual practitioner surveys, key informant interviews with many of our members, which represent, you know, all the major organisations working on cash transfer programming, organisational surveys as well, etc. And not only is it intended to tell us, okay, how are we doing against these collective commitments, but then also to showcase some of the good practices as well as some remaining barriers and challenges, and really hold a mirror up to the system, because as I'll touch upon, there are still some quite divergent views in terms of how we maximise the potential of cash programming. So it's structured around these 6 objectives, and in addition, it touches upon some of the really critical debates that are also kind of cutting across these objectives and that link cash to some broader, some of the other grand bargain work streams, but also some of the kind of broader reform agendas. So, for example, digital identity, as we've been talking about, financial inclusion, linkages between cash programming and social protection. So those are just a little snapshot. So although the report isn't published yet, I'm going to share a little sneak preview of some of the findings, which are on the next slide, and probably not very legible from far away, but you can see some figures. I couldn't work out how to break it up. I'm not very PDF expert. So anyway, I'll just ask you to take a look at them whilst I kind of go through some of these findings, and be interested to hear your views afterwards on whether that resonates with your own experiences. So objective 1, which was ensure sufficient funding is available for cash programming. So as has been alluded to by colleagues earlier on, the global spend on cash and vouchers has indeed increased from previous years, and although it's still quite hard to quantify because not all agencies kind of track expenditure and funding for cash in the same way, we're looking at about 8.5% of humanitarian assistance in 2016. Now, is that a lot? Is it not? It is proportionately to 2010, but if you look at how that compares to some of the commitments that were made at the World Humanitarian Summit by certain agencies, you know, the most extreme being, say, World Vision saying 50% of their assistance would be through cash transfer programming by 2020, you can see we still have a way to go. So this whole debate about whether we should set, you know, targets or not is still quite live, but nonetheless, in my opinion, this 8.5% is not quite the level of progress that we'd like to see. And so that's despite, or in a context where there are a whole range of policy and strategy commitments being made by donors and by agencies on the increase of cash transfer programming as a proportion of their assistance. But whilst there are these commitments, there's quite a lot of divergence in terms of those commitments. So some of the issues that are, like, for example, do you consider cash and vouchers within one same overall kind of type of programming? You know, as Tahir touched upon earlier, commodity vouchers, you know, some agencies might be thinking now, well, no, that's actually just a different form of in-kind aid. But others might say, no, absolutely, that's still market-based programming. We should consider it within this overall envelope. And another sort of divergence we might see is around whether or not, you know, cash should be provided as one single multi-purpose unrestricted transfer, or whether it can be just as effective to have, you know, a number of different transfers to try and meet, or different forms of assistance to try and meet multiple objectives. And these divergences are reflected at the donor level as well as at the operational agency level, and they are part of the reason why it's difficult to have a kind of collective agenda for how these grand bargain commitments can be implemented in a given context. So looking then at objective number 2, which is that ensure cash is routinely considered. So again, as you can see there from some of the statistics, 81% of organisations agree that CTP is being routinely considered by decision makers. That's very positive. And I think what is interesting is to see that is, whilst there's divergence between sectors, there is more and more consideration of cash as a means to meet different sectoral objectives, including nutrition, as we touched upon earlier on. And that's been supported both by the policy commitments and by greater embedding of tools and processes for market analysis and for response analysis. There is still, and again Tahir touched on it earlier on, this idea of the reticence and sort of risk-averse attitude, I suppose, of certain sectors and certain organisations. And some of that is real. Can cash really be used to meet certain quality outcomes in shelter and nutrition, to name a couple? But some of it is also due to this kind of notion of perceived risk. And I think that this whole risk agenda is one that still needs to be really addressed collectively, and that evidence base continuously built up. Objective number 3, capacity. So only 40% of organisations believe that they have enough capacity to implement cash transfer programming. I think this is, again, one where we see a lot of divergence. So, Tahir talked about the WFP program and training 2,700 people in a year. Now, that takes a huge amount of resources, and that's not a luxury that's afforded to all organisations. I think that donors have potentially underestimated the level of investment needed across the board to be able to make that necessary step change. But this is also tied up with a question of where should we be investing? If we're talking about shock responsive social protection systems, for example, then actually, is there a need to invest heavily in the machinery of, say, international NGOs? Or if we're talking about, as some donors are kind of considering, directly contracting the private sector to do the cash transfer part, then what does that mean for the types of capacities that need to be invested in? And so, again, how does this link with the localization agenda? And should we be investing in, local civil society? And I mean, it's a quite sort of complex space. And I think that without that alignment on what investment and capacity looks like, I think it's we'll continue to see this sort of fractured level of investment. Nonetheless, as I think Paul mentioned earlier on, there has been a significant shift amongst many organisations in terms of their investment in their organisational capacity. Okay, objective 4, ensure quality. This is a very broad one, but I guess one of the questions could be, is the quality of cash transfer programming, advancing commensurately with the scale, really? And are we really looking at cross-sectoral outcomes in a holistic way? My sense is that cash programming has forced us to look at outcomes and to look at outcomes multi-sectorally, and I think that's why it poses a challenge, because many sectors are not set up to do that, and let alone set up to do that across sectors. We tend to monitor sectors separately, and when we're thinking about broader concepts of well-being and basic needs, and then also looking at intra-household dynamics and so on, we're just not very good at measuring that, nor knowing what we want to measure, nor knowing who is responsible for measuring that. And I think that remains an obstacle to having a really strong evidence base. The other obstacle, and I think this really comes out clearly in the report, is the issue of coordination. So cash doesn't fit neatly within the coordination architecture that's sort of sector or cluster based. In particular, this whole notion of multi-purpose cash, and there's a sort of conflation between whichever agency is responsible for implementing, whichever agency might be responsible for coordinating multi-purpose cash will also have control over the implementation of it, and that comes with whole dynamics between, particularly UN agency control over resources and coordination. So I think the stats there are quite telling in that there's very little confidence that there will be significant change. There's no sense of there's a low proportion of respondents see that there's predictability of cash coordination. The recurrence of this issue across contexts, I think, is problematic. On the plus side, there are so many opportunities to seize where, taking us outside of our sort of humanitarian cluster, siloed sort of way of thinking in terms of the potential for cash to better allow us to coordinate with social protection, with development actors, with government. And I think that's the opportunity that we need to be seizing rather than staying stuck in the idea of how do we get cash to fit within a sort of a cluster system that may or may not, last, into the next decade or so, let's say. Then finally, objective 6. This is a whistle-stop tour, but just some little snapshots. So there you can see that whilst the case has been made and the evidence is certainly there for why CTP should be considered as a response modality, you can see that when we're talking about using CTP appropriately across sectors and then informing the selection of operating models for CTP, and I'll touch on that in a second, the evidence is more scant. And I think this question of the operational models is probably one of the biggest ones at the moment, and unfortunately it's slightly sort of sidelined bigger questions or other questions on looking at outcomes, for example. But there are a number of different models that are being put forwards and being tested in different contexts, all of which are an attempt by either the operating agencies or the donors who are encouraging these models to increase the efficiency, effectiveness, and accountability of how cash is being delivered. Now, delivered and planned, designed, delivered, and monitored. And I'm imagine that some of you will have heard about some of the more, probably one of the most controversial of these sort of experiments, which Paul has recently written about, which was in Lebanon, where DFID and ECHO put forward a joint tender to have a single agency delivering cash and then a parallel third-party monitoring system. Many of these efforts are, all these efforts are driven by similar principles, but whether or not they work in given context is the big question. And what does that mean for the role of NGOs? What does it mean for donor alignment? Because if there continue to be these divergences between donors on cash versus vouchers, etc., then how can they all align around one single system in a given country? And so I think building the evidence base around this, around what models drive efficiency and effectiveness and accountability in what context, and what is replicable, and how does that link to broader reform, so on, will definitely be one of the sort of hot topics of the next couple of years. I'm aware of time, so that was just a little snapshot of some of the findings to date, and I hope you'll get a chance to read the report when it comes out. I've shared with you something which, a short summary of the Global Cash Forum, which CALP hosted in June in Geneva, and which touched on many of the same issues, also around these 6 objectives, brought together a whole range of speakers to share experiences and reflections on how the cash reform is playing out. So that's a little sort of taster. Just to touch on the gender issue, and I hope we do get to discuss this a bit more. Nothing I had to say has not been touched upon before necessarily, but I think that for me the gender issue kind of is a bit emblematic of the idea that we try and attribute too many things to cash, right? We're talking about a transfer that is finite in its duration in time and that only meets a proportion of household needs, often maybe only a proportion of food needs, and we expect it to be transformational in terms of resilience, gender dynamics, whatever it might be. And we often view it in isolation rather than thinking about it as part of broader programming in that context, or the critical importance of kind of behaviour change efforts and longer term development approaches. So I think we probably just need to turn it on its head a little bit and think, okay, well, how can cash be used as humanitarian cash transfer programming be used as a means to increase those linkages between humanitarian and development programming, and think about longer term gender outcomes in that sense, rather than expecting miracles from short-term programs in challenging environments. Look forward to your reflections on all that.